Hello everyone, this is Carlos Garrido from Midwestern Marxist. Today we are in the midst of a very frightening rise in cases of depression, in cases of suicides and suicides attempts. And we have to ask, well, what is the root of this fundamental crisis of meaning, this crisis of purpose that is being experienced by so many people today that leads some into a terrible condition of despair and others into a condition where life is itself not worth living? What is the root of this? This is a problem that philosophy has been grappling for a century at least. At the turn of the century, there was a very prominent German philosopher, Max Scheler, who argued that this development in industrial capitalism, this development in what he called the capitalist ethos, the spirit of capitalism, has led us to a condition where we're able to live longer and longer lives that are worth less and less living. And this seems to be somewhat the reality today for most of the people in our country. Now, whereas the philosophers looked at this fact and interpreted what in the culture, what in the realm of ideas could be leading to this, what in the capitalist spirit, in the values of the society can be leading to it, we Marxists analyze things from a different perspective. We don't ignore the existing values that might have led to this. We don't ignore the cultural situation that might have led to this. But we realize that behind those existing values and behind that cultural situation, there is a mode of production that is at the foundation of society. We understand that before we can even have culture, before we can have movies, literature, videos on YouTube, we need to eat, we need to clothe ourselves, and we need to produce the things that are necessary to sustain human life and to sustain a human community. And we understand also that according to how we produce those things that are necessary, the culture and the atmosphere and the values and even the languages that we end up having are conditioned by that economic foundation, by that realm of production. So when we look at the crisis of meaning, when we look at a phenomena like the one that we are experiencing today, our heads should turn towards the economic system and see what is it in the way that we produce for the subsistence of our community, of our nation, of our country, of the world. What is it there that, what can we see there in relationship to this cultural fact, to this crisis of meaning? And what we find is something that if you're a Marxist, you should be quite familiar with. We find a horrific condition of exploitation where people go to work, they have no say in their work, they have no decision-making power about what the product of their labor ends up being done with the product of their labor, how they work, who they work with, what materials they work on. They're alienated from their work, and subsequently they're also exploited from their work. A big portion of their work doesn't even go towards them. The value that they create is just surplus value. It's value that ends up turning into capital and that ends up being used by his enemy. And because of that, his product confronts him as an alien. And as he makes the owner of the company richer, as he creates the conditions for capital to continue expanding, he also creates the conditions for himself to remain in misery. And this is the fundamental contradiction in capitalism, the contradiction between the forces and the relations of productions, the contradictions between a socialized mode of production and a privatized mode of accumulation. So we see that in the core of society, in the foundation, in that first historical act, and that first thing that presupposes everything else in the society, we already have a crisis. Crisis comes from the word in Greek, krisis. And krisis refers to a separation. And what we have at the core of society, what we have in the economic realm, in the realm of production, is a separation of the people that do the work from their work and from the decision-making process that goes into their work. And this is the fundamental condition of capitalism. Capitalism cannot exist unless it is able to continue perpetuating these conditions, because without these conditions, there would be no capital. There would be no growth of capital, which is something that is entailed implicitly in capital itself. In order for something to be capital, It has to participate in this relationship where it has a central variable, which is labor, which it exploits. And this is where we find, as Marxists, the crisis of meaning. This is where we find this fundamental separation. And what has happened is that this crisis of meaning has slowly entered the cultural life of our nation and of other nations that are engaged in the same mode of production. And it reflects itself in these conditions of depression, in these rising suicide rates and rising cases of suicide attempts. So philosophy might be helpful in analyzing what in the culture is leading to these horrific conditions, but it hasn't been particularly helpful in analyzing what is presupposed in those cultural conditions that lead to depression and suicides. And what we find is that only Marxist philosophy, only dialectical materialism has been able to provide a concrete answer, which is that the crisis is at the core of the economic system, and that from that core, it then determines cultural life according to that separation which we find at the foundation of society. So our response is not simply just medicate people, which is what ends up happening when people go to doctors saying, and they tell them that they suffer depression or that they are in a suicidal mindset. We go deeper than that. We say, sure, if the medication helps, take it, but we also have to examine what led to this situation in the first place, what is presupposed in you coming here in the first place. And what we find is that it is an economic system that at its core is engaged in exploitative activity that leads many people to engage in most of their day in doing something that they can think is completely meaningless, worthless, and that leaves them feeling like a cog of a machine, like a cog in a machine, and not as like a rational social being that can creatively exert his mental and physical capacities upon different objects and upon nature and different raw materials. So our response to the crisis is that we have to change the economic system. We have to change how it is that we make things, allow people to meaningfully engage in production, and from there we will see that the culture will subsequently change so that this crisis of meaning, this crisis of despair will be no longer.